Greetings and welcome to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians and not the storm the Capitol kind. So if you're curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christianity looks like, this is the podcast for you. My name is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter and I'm your host. I am a professor of theology and the lead pastor of the Loft faith community at Westwood United Methodist Church in Los Angeles, California. Today, I'm excited to be joined by a political trio, is what I'll call us, a political trinity. I don't know, Wesley, and we are joined by Everest. How are y'all doing today?
Doing good.
Well,
Yeah. A political trinity. I love it.
That's basic. I mean, like that's what I mean. We're the of the people who are on this podcast. We are the ones who are the folks who just stay in the weeds with politics. So I think that is probably the most apt way to describe us. But Wesley, I didn't tell you because I was waiting until we were on the podcast to say this, but we have had a few people leave reviews where they specifically requested to have Everest on the podcast more.
Hey, that's
They're like, let's say more Everest. I was like, wow, okay. No one's saying more me, but that's because I'm on every time anyway. So
I'm a crowd favorite.
Love it.
You're
Love
definitely a crowd favorite. So I will make sure that you are in the top of the tagline so people know like Everest was here. So that way I know they listen to this episode if they
The
specifically.
title of the podcast is Everest is Back.
Everest is back.
Love it. What are we talking about? No idea, but on the title, but Everest is back.
They'll know. They'll know. So in today's episode, we will be discussing fascism and the role Christianity has played in promoting it. Lovely stuff. I want to just say a little bit about, I guess, who's been described as the woke Marxist Pope, Leo the 14th. And then we have a... Oh yeah. Oh God. Yes.
Wow.
Now I'm excited you haven't heard it now. Yeah. And we have a question from a listener that we want to discuss about Satan, actually, and about what we believe about that. So stay tuned for that at the end because that's going to be interesting. So again, I want a little bit about just recapping our episode because we had our last conversation last week around the Pope, and then of course they actually had a 1-day conclave. So essentially when we published our episode, Leo had already been chosen the first American Pope who, according to, if you were to ask me, according to the racial hierarchy that I have been trained in, we have a black Pope because his grandparents are black. And
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, no, it's people from New Orleans. His people are like black, they're black like my family. So they're black, and like when you go down south, and they're like these light skinned people, and like we know as black Louisianans, we're like, okay, they black. You know what I'm saying? Like I looked at them and I was like, oh yeah, like you mean you know what to look for when you are down there. But yeah, his one grandfather is Haitian, and his grandmother was Creole, and so according to the one drop rule, which is ridiculous, but a rule that has existed and still, broadly speaking, exists with respect to racial categorization. He is non-white, I would say, at minimum.
Okay.
But
I kind of love that for the first American Pope.
Exactly, and I think it's very subtle. Everybody's like, "Oh, they're talking about his Creole roots." That's what they say, his Creole roots. I'm like, is that the way you want to mask saying he's not white? But it is interesting having an American Pope, or I should say a Pope from the United States of America, because obviously Argentina is in the Americas as such. So it's not like we don't want to forget South America. But so essentially, for those of you who don't know, Laura Loomer is this super conservative social media presence. And she tweeted that she quote tweeted a tweet that Pope Leo had done, I guess, where he was critiquing Donald Trump's immigration policies and said that he was a woke Marxist Pope. And so if you look on TikTok, people have, of course, made that into many songs that are funny. So I was like, all right, if we're gonna have a black Pope, I'd like to have a woke Marxist black Pope. So
bring it on.
I was in love with it. So anyway, I mean, he's not really woke. I would say he is in the tradition of Francis, where he's conservative on some things, the things that traditional Catholics have been conservative on with respect to gender and sexuality, marriage roles, and women ordained, but progressive on he specifically took the name Pope Leo because he talks about Leo the 13th as his famous, in my circles, famous
I was like,
encyclical,
famous to who?
famous to us nerds, where he's really critiquing. It's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and he's talking about workers' rights and economic justice. And this is where I would say the Roman Catholic Church has been much more progressive than the Protestant Church with respect to economic justice. And he picks up this mantle and specifically talks about capitalism and the role capitalism has played on devastating the economy. He talks about AI in his first address. I mean, I was like, this is Nat for me. It's like, okay, you got some, I see where people want to call him woke because he's actually talking about like what's happening in the world. But obviously there are many other things that follow along conservative lines. So anyway.
Yeah,
Well,
I thought
we take the wins we can get.
Exactly.
We take the wins.
I was just gonna say I thought boo to the first couple of things that you said about being conservative or like more of a centrist about LGBT and women's inclusion. So still boo to that for me. But I'll take him being labeled a woke pope because I feel like it, if anything, helps move the Catholic Church in a direction that I would prefer.
Definitely. And maybe we have to recognize that, the majority of brown people in the world are, if they're religious, are Catholic. I mean, Roman Catholicism is still the dominant religion in South America. It's growing in Africa. And so we just have to take that seriously. On to what we see happening all around us if we open our eyes, the increasing role of fascism in our government. I wanted to frame this in a way to help people understand what fascism is, because I feel like a lot of people are saying this is fascist or that is fascist without really knowing what we mean when we say fascism. And quite honestly, and I think at some point we'll come up to this conversation question, like why for some people they're totally fine with the fact that it's like they're fine with the fact that it's fascist. Like you're convincing them, they're like, yeah, fascism is fine as long as it's my kind of fascism. And so that I think is deeply, obviously problematic. But if we want to start with the definition of fascism, I am pulling from Jason Stanley's book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. And Stanley was a professor at Yale. I actually should just Google it because I know he did change. I think he got a position at Oxford or Cambridge. I think it's in the UK. But he defines fascism as a ultranationalism in some variety. So either ethnic ultranationalism, religious, cultural, or some combination of the three, with the nation represented in a person of in the persona of an authoritarian leader who speaks on the nation's behalf. So it's about some kind of ultranationalism that's very narrow, and where it requires a particular kind of authoritarian leader, which everybody's supposed to bend the knee to. And I know, Everest, you had mentioned the importance of the kind of politics of us and them with respect to how we might understand fascism as it's played out in the real world.
Well, I think, that I highly recommend Jason Stanley's book. I think reading that in the year of our Lord 2025 should be required for everyone. But I think that is a very clear manifestation that we see right now and has been true historically in fascist regimes, is having clear enemies and having a really clear in-group and out-group. And so I felt like that was important to include in the definition.
Definitely, because I think you have to have a clear enemy, and also you have to present yourself as virtuous, right? And so like you as if you are in the role of the fascist in this scenario, you have to basically make the argument that everything you're doing is right and virtuous and true and good, and everything that the them is doing is evil, wrong, and fundamentally undermining what you're trying to accomplish. And I think this can be best expressed for those of you who maybe haven't seen Donald Trump's interview. I don't think it wasn't on 60 Minutes. It was on ABC News, I think, where he said they're talking about the economy, and he was talking about how he keeps calling it Biden's economy. And one of the questions the interviewer asked him, when will it shift from a Biden's economy to a Trump economy? And then Trump said, well, it's already shifting, and all the bad parts are Joe Biden's economy, and all the good parts are my economy or my economic policies. And I was just like, how can you actually take this argument seriously, where you just literally, the way you are, like, distinguishing your
Mm-hmm.
economic principles as bad and good, not
Mm-hmm.
actually using economic
Mm-hmm.
terms, just does it on vibes, right? The good
Yeah.
vibes are me, and the bad vibes are that guy.
Well, and that speaks to, I mean, I think a lot of fascist movements are truly just kind of defined by what they are not. And I think that is a really good example of just being like, well, the thing is that we are good and the other stuff is bad. And a lot of it is just vibes. Like, a lot of it is just kind of saying, don't you like the vibes over here? And the vibes over there are really bad. Don't ask too many questions about it. So I know that is like a silly example, and it's a mind-blowingly stupid thing to witness, but it also is a really good, like, encapsulation of how the ideology works, truly.
100%. And I think it's also like what it reminds me of, and this is maybe an outlandish claim, but I don't think it is, this idea of like there's an outgroup and then there's a virtuous, we are the virtuous. It just sounds like conservative Christianity.
I mean, that's basically it. And I think that's the whole, essentially the essence of what I want this episode to be, is helping us understand how Christianity ultimately is the vehicle through which fascist ideology spreads and is presented as virtuous, as good, or as biblical. And the language that I think might be helpful here is, there's an article, or I think actually technically it's a section of a chapter, in a book written by Dorothy, and I think you pronounce her name Sewell, who is a German liberation theologian who passed away. I want to say, yeah, she died in 2003, when she was 73 years old. And she has an article. Essentially, she coined the term Christofascism, basically. And she argues that Christofascism essentially is like the kind of conservative, religious right, moral majority, um, that she saw emerging in the 80s. And again, you have to reckon. So her last name is Sewell. She is German. She was born in 29. She saw the rise of German Lutheran fascism, like, the way in which the German Lutheran
Mm-hmm.
Church adopted Nazi principles. And so she could, I think, see what was happening in America very clearly, very plainly, because it's something that she remembered seeing as a child. I think the term Christofascism is helpful, to describe fundamentalist Christianity, in as much as it makes us as Christians aware of the ways in which Christianity can be and has, unfortunately, historically been weaponized. I mean, even starting with, I mean, we could even, if you want to go way back to Constantine, the fact that Constantine legalizes Christianity because at this point it has spread far enough that he can know he can use it as a tool to garner support, for his version and his vision of the Roman Empire in like the 500s. That he's using religion in that way, and his mother was actually a Christian. We have no idea if he actually was. He's assumed to have been, but this has been the Christ like from the very beginning. Christianity was outside of the government, and once it got assumed and subsumed in some government form, it has forever changed. And really, we're talking about, I would argue, a pre-Constantinian Christianity and a post-Constantinian Christianity, if you want to get like down to the brass tacks. But again, this is us, my nerdy self, understanding how we might talk about what we mean when we're saying Christianity.
And I think it's so important because it sort of highlights that this combining of state power and Christianity has been with us for a really, really long time. And so for me, it sort of helps uh, explain why it's so difficult to disentangle and pull people towards a better view, a better practice of Christianity, uh, because it's like in our DNA in some ways.
Mm, mm.
I would love to share the quote that Wesley and I both
Oh
love.
Yes.
yes.
Um, it says this ideological mixture of nationalism, militarism, family ideology, hostility to working people, and blind hatred of communism is compounded with Christianity by the religious right. The Christian religion is made the vehicle of these ideologies, so that in many cases, people who are outside the churches have no conception of Christianity except in this Christo-fascist form. The deepest meaning of the Christian religion is conformed and subordinated to fears and threatening lies, to hate and the will to destroy, which I think goes all the way back to Constantine as Christianity as a cultural force being removed from the actual religion and principles of Christianity, so that the presence of Christianity in a cultural way becomes this like huge harmful thing that we now see.
Yeah. And that a lot of us, especially, I mean, I'll speak for myself as a queer Christian, we have experienced this sort of like negativity towards our communities, towards ourselves, and have had to navigate those realities as we try to maintain our Christianity.
So one of the things that Stanley writes, in terms of how we might actually, what are some of the foundational requirements for fascism. And again, I want to talk about the role that Christianity has played in this, is the cultivation of a mythic past. He writes, fascist politicians justify their ideas by breaking down a common sense of history and creating a mythic past to support their vision for the present. They rewrite the population's shared understanding of reality by twisting the language of ideals through propaganda and promoting anti-intellectualism, attacking universities and educational systems that might challenge their ideas. Like, this is fundamentally what we see happening right now, is the creation of a mythic past that just that the great again, right? It's all about the America great again. This time immemorial that maybe it was the 30s, maybe it was the robber barons. We're trying to figure that out, where America was great and things were easier for you, and by again, you meaning
Yep.
those who feel victimized, right? Like, it's all this coded language such that people can say, yes, that's the past that I know perhaps even truthfully didn't exist, but it's the past that I want to exist because it's the future that I want. And it's when you create this mythic past, you give and you foment resentment against the people you believe, the them that are against this mythic past, right? That and because they are the reason why you are suffering. They're the reason why you don't have a job. They're the reason why your life is more difficult, is because they actually have dismantled the systems that allowed this mythical past to exist.
But it isn't even so much that, like, obviously we see exactly what the Trump administration is doing right now with their attack on universities and on social services and trying to take away any sort of dissenting thought that may exist. But like, this mythic past has been with us for a really long time. Whenever anyone talks about the United States being founded as a Christian nation, like as an articulation as to why we have to get back towards Christianity being the dominant religion in this country, as if it's ever stopped being that. It's just a form that I don't agree with. But it's still very present. It's still very here. It's also like, yeah, I mean, it's mythical in a lot of ways, because these things probably never existed. The people who are now wanting to go back to whatever decade they think was better, uh, don't have a real understanding of what like day to day life was, even for people at the top of the social hierarchy. They assume that they would be there, but the reality is the people in control, or the people with access and wealth, had a very different life than even like a regular working class person would have had in that time, whenever that mythical time was, whatever decade they hope to articulate as being the one that they want to return to. So it's yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I just this it's just such a frustrating experience to hear people want that, not knowing at all what it meant for their health, for their ability to thrive, for their children's education. I mean, we're seeing this return of measles, as if measles wasn't this totally terrible thing that existed, but people want to go back to that because they've lost connection with what that actually even means.
Well, I think measles is a really great like that is a really good example of what does it mean to return to the past, and we have this like fake idealized white supremacist past that doesn't actually exist, and the reality of regressing is measles. The reality is like people being very sick and very harmed. Um and Wesley, while you were talking, I was thinking about, I don't know if y'all saw this, but last week the Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, gave a speech that was like the future of labor in America is returning to factory work and having factories where people and their children and their grandchildren will all have the same jobs in the same factories. And I was like, that is the past that we miss. That is the thing that we are striving for, is going back to generational labor with probably terrible conditions like that. So it's interesting because it's both that the past doesn't exist, but also the false nostalgia is like being applied to things that are worse. And so in convincing people that they want to return to something, I feel like the people in power are able to select parts of the past that are actually not beneficial, but since it is still some kind of return, it's almost a following through on the promises that they're making.
No, exactly. I think it allows them to create an illusion, and again, as you said, nostalgia of the past, such that they look back on these factory jobs that left these Rust Belt states. They're like, remember when we had a good job that had good insurance, that people felt like they could afford to pay for a house with just one income, and the one of the partners, the mom or the woman, could stay home. And that's what they're trying to say by saying it's these factory jobs, but they're not talking about the reason why those jobs left, which is because people like Howard Lutnick, billionaires, like took these jobs overseas to extort and to extract like wealth from these other places where they could pay less wages and have less environmental protections, and create these goods. Like we are a consumer society, not a society that produces much anymore, right? And that's just the reality of what the economics have shifted within our country. And so trying to go back to something like that isn't gonna make it so while it may help you have a job, it doesn't mean you're gonna be able to afford to buy a house. It doesn't mean you're gonna be able to afford to not have two people working. It doesn't mean you're gonna be able to afford to have healthcare or daycare or pay for kids to go to college. Like all it means is you're gonna have a job. But this is where I think the anti-intellectualism comes in, where they don't want you to think. They don't want you to actually ask critical questions that address like the reason why these things happened in the first place and how to ultimately prevent them again. It's more than just having a job. Having a job is very important. People need to feel valued. People need to feel heard and have a sense of purpose. However, it is about fundamentally wealth redistribution, is the consolidation of wealth. When you look at statistically how much the factory worker made in 1950 relative to the CEO to now, you see that extreme jump. You see that extreme concentration of wealth. That is the issue. But they don't want to talk about taxes in that way, right?
But
Well, and
also, like,
also, oh,
go for it.
sorry.
No, no,
Go
no.
ahead.
All you.
I was gonna say, when people are like, my grandfather had a factory job, he was having a great time. There's also like, but that was also the golden age of unions. Like that is also when
100%.
there was a lot of class consciousness, which is something that they don't want. And so I think when we, as a common people, are saying that we long for the good old days of labor, that also includes a level of solidarity and workers' rights and community advocacy that the government explicitly does not want. And so I think that is also important to know, is that if we had a return to factory labor, the the good parts of that would not return. And so it would actually just be, I think, terrible conditions. And like you said, Dr. Carter, people being overworked and people not getting the good parts of that they imagine would also come back. Sorry, Wesley, you go ahead.
No, no. I mean, it's fully aligned with what you're saying. Part of that mythic past is that, like, it's not even true that people want to return to manufacturing. Um, we'll put it in the notes, but the Cato Institute, gross, I know, but they did a survey that asked that posited the question: America would be better off if more people worked in manufacturing. 80% of Americans agree, 20% disagree. And then I would be better off if I worked in a factory. 25% of Americans agree, 73% disagree.
Right.
And only 2% currently work in a factory. So it's like, what are you wanting? Because it's not true. You don't want to work in a factory.
Yeah, no, you're right. This is why we have H-1B visas and immigrant labor. That's exactly what it is.
100%.
They're like, we need people to grow food, but I don't want to grow the food. Like, we need factories, but I don't want to work in a factory, right? And so, but if you're not working in the factory, like, then you're not getting the benefits of that wealth, right? Like, you're not. And so, again, Wesley, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of the idea of what people think they want versus what they actually, because they know we're still close enough to remember that what factory work really actually is. And it's not to discredit people who still do that necessary and important work. Rather, it's to recognize that for many of us, that's not the work that actually gives us a sense of purpose, that gives us a sense of identity. And there's lots of reasons for that. We can, need to get into, Fordism and all other kinds of stuff that I spend my strange hours thinking about. But I think there needs to be work that cultivates a sense of purpose. One of the things I'm going to say is the role religion has played in kind of normalizing this way in view of capitalism and even work, right? There's a way in which conservative Christianity, especially with respect to work, looks at work and what they might call like hard work and saying like, this is what one must do, like, to actually be a Christian, like to actually be a good Christian. You need to not only be employed, but we need to think you are quote unquote working hard. And this is how they justify like, not having social programs unless somebody has a job. They're trying to tie Medicaid to people
To work requirements.
We're like, what if you're an elderly retired person? Clearly you cannot work. And the paperwork you would have to do to say you don't work would mean you will probably lose your medical coverage because you don't have the time or like awareness or understanding of how to do the paperwork, right? And they are pulling this from scripture passages like, oh, if you don't work, you don't eat, like, those kinds of framings, right, are being used, or they will use the one about render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and God unto what is God, like multiple times in different ways, incorrectly, because that actually is about paying taxes, which they don't ever want to talk about. And so they use Christianity to justify this kind of work requirement in a capitalistic framework that normalizes private property, that normalizes wealth, that doesn't take a critical look at the fact that Jesus is constantly critiquing wealth. They're like, well, look at Solomon. He was super wealthy. I'm like, Jesus says, that a wealthy person, like, it can get, what does he say? I forgot the passage about the camel and eye of the needle, but whatever. You know
it's
what I'm talking
easier
about.
for wealth. Why am I the one trying to bring this to memory?
I was like,
It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God.
here we go.
And this is why you're a crowd favorite.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, but like, I mean, that's the thing, is there's so much critique of this in the New Testament. It requires a creation of a mythical past that glosses over what Jesus actually said, that reinterprets the Hebrew Bible in ways that supports, like, these policies. And one of the ways in particular, Wesley, that I want to lift up that you had mentioned was militarism, and the way Christianity has what these groups of conservative Christians do is they look at the conquest narratives, especially in Leviticus, or in Exodus, in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Well, that's when they start, and then you get the narratives in Joshua and Judges, that talks about how they go into Israel and, I mean, quite honestly, commit genocides, like just murder and devastate people. And they use this as a means of justifying the kind of militarism, imperial, militaristic dominance that we ought have, because it is quote unquote biblical. When in truth, like, I think the book is behind me, where one of my good friends that's going to be actually at our church next week, Kate Conman, in her book Undoing Conquest, talks about how this is a mythic past, that how that conquest narrative, it didn't happen. It was created. They wrote that, like the priests wrote this after they were actually in Babylonian captivity, like to give them a sense of like they created their own mythic past basically to give them a sense of strength to say this is who we should be or who we could have been, when we know that it was more of a settler style occupation. They came and they settled the land and integrated with what we now call Canaanites, or like Arabs essentially. And so that, I think that's the framing that they used to justify the militarism that I know, Wesley, you wanted to kind of talk a little bit about from the article, but also
Yeah,
fascism in general.
totally. So I think one of the things that fascism has on its side, one of the things that it highlights is sort of this strength, sort of a strong leader. And what it has me thinking, there's a quote in the article that you shared. The military political doctrine of national security has largely replaced the older political values and convictions of democracy, freedom of the press, human rights. Instead, national security has become the foundation of politics. And because so much of the Christianity in America is sort of like tied in with our sense of sort of conservative politics, there is this that I've seen in progressive spaces where Christians do articulate um, sort of a need for like national violence. Like I remember a conversation about we had gone to DC to do some advocacy, and we had brought back to the community a conversation about what we were doing, and it sort of developed into a conversation about were we right to drop a bomb on Hiroshima during World War II? And there were people in the room, progressive Christians, who were like, yeah, that was the right thing to do. And so like it's so difficult to disentangle the sense of militarism and state violence, even even in spaces that we would consider sort of progressive, that I don't know, it just, for me, it continues to highlight how integrated, how sort of in our body, so much of these toxic understandings about violence or militarism, so they continue to exist and persist.
And it's so, like, whenever I taught a class on Christian perspectives on War and Peace and World War II, the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, Nazis. These are all the framings through which we would have these really difficult discussions that would ultimately lead us into conversations around the death penalty and things of that nature. Um, because they are by their very nature complex and complicated, right? They just, by their very nature, they're complex and
Yeah,
complicated. And if you are a Christian and you're like, I don't think we should have dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, then they're like, well, you're not for America. Like you,
100%. That's
you
literally what
know.
happened. And it's like, I don't understand how you're sitting in this room surrounded by Christians who are progressive, and you're just articulating violence as justified towards just a people group. It's just beyond me.
No, it's extremely frustrating because I think what happens is we don't understand how it once you make an exception to the rule, like once you begin to normalize violence in some sense, ultimately what you're arguing, you're creating the pathway through which violence can be used on you. That's essentially what's happening. And we see that happening even right now with the ways in which people are arguing that undocumented or people who are not U.S. citizens don't have rights to due process, right? And they're like,
Mm-hmm.
well,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, actually, the Constitution says all persons. That means everybody. It doesn't say anything about citizenship. And now, I don't know if y'all saw this. I just heard this morning, that they are Stephen Miller was on Fox News arguing that maybe we need to pull back habeas
Mm-hmm.
corpus, which basically means you have a right to a trial if you're arrested, right? You have a right to a trial. You just can't be arrested for no reason. The two times in American history where we have suspended habeas were the Civil War,
Mm-hmm.
because Civil War, like literally internal war, makes sense. Lots of people were getting arrested all over the place because war,
Uh-huh.
on our grounds. Like that is like one time we're like, extenuating circumstances. And unfortunately, the interment
Japanese
of,
internment.
yeah. And I'm like, we shouldn't be like, let's do that again. Like
Yeah.
that's insane. Like that is insane. I'm like, there's two times we did it. So I think what people don't understand, what I want them to understand, what I want our listeners to understand, is that due process is for you. It's for your protection. Like even if you're like, I don't know how I feel about immigration. Like if you let them take away rights. Once you normalize something that they can take it away, they will take it away from you when it's about power. And again, this ties into religion and authoritarianism, where you have this idea of an all-powerful God that can do no wrong. That is presented in this authoritarian figure that says, if you question me, you are questioning the patriarchal values. You're questioning the role that God has ordained me to lead. And so when you find these churches and these religious institutions that treat their clergy like gods, they are laying the groundwork. They are laying the foundations upon which you're creating folks who are ultimately teaching people the kind of theologies they need to vote for folks like fascists, because they believe, because it feels, I know we talked about it a few weeks ago, complex PTSD, it feels normal to them to have someone to say, this is what we should do, and this is why it's right, and I know it's right, and so you have to trust me because I'm the strong leader.
Well, not just normal, but familiar and comforting, I think, to if that is the role that you are very used to playing. I think voting for someone that continues to put you in that role would feel like the not only the normal thing to do, but the way to stay safe.
Yeah, the safe thing to do. And I know at Everest, I thought, I know we had talked about when we were doing our meeting, like the role of the kind of charismatic leaders in terms of how the role that has played in um, not Christianity, but also the rise of kind of Christo fascism.
Well, so in that article that we keep talking about, we should put it in the show
Oh,
notes.
I'm definitely gonna put in the show notes. Yeah, because it's like it's not it's well known in like the Christian, like anti-fascist, like liberation decolonial theologian circles. So that's like all 15 of us, like we know about this article. Maybe I might be generous to say there's 100 of us, but there's not that many. But anyway, please continue, Everest.
Well, I think my fixation this entire year has kind of been from a sociological perspective, trying to understand where this whole movement came from and started. And obviously, there are so many different places and methods. But I think in this particular article, something that I thought was really interesting was that the writer traces the religious right back to an origin of capitalism and selling Christianity as though it is a prize, a product to be won. And I think that is just really interesting to think about the starting with the charisma and then later preying on people's fears instead of starting with the fear. Um, and I think both things happen, but I think framing it in that way, I just thought was really interesting. And that is just a theology I feel very wary of, because I have seen it harm so many people. And I think the idea, there's a quote in the article that is like, people are told that in giving, they are doing what God wants, and then God will provide back to them. And if God is not providing to them, they are not giving enough or they are not sacrificing enough. And I call that like Santa Claus God theology, but I think that I have seen that hurt so many people who really buy into it and just think that if they just do enough, their life will magically be fixed like a game show. Um, but I think tying that into the origins of Christo-fascism was a cool connection for me.
100%. Because I think the article sort of also articulates that like wealth, fame, and power are sort of the basic American values. And so what we see in some of these early, I think the author is talking about televangelists, Jerry Falwell types, is this connection between money and religion, this success in religion, like give and you will have these things. And so when the American values are wealth, fame, and power, and there's this Christian tradition or Christian denomination, I don't know what to call them, that brings that and says, if you give, you will get wealth, fame, and power. You're like feeding into the things that are bubbling subconsciously, to the point that the author says that the connection between money and religion, being rich and being pious, is no longer even a subject for reflection. And that's crazy given how much Jesus talks about the toxicity of wealth. in the scriptures. It's unquestionable in some of these prosperity gospel communities.
And I would say, like, I feel more nervousness around preaching around economics and wealth at our congregation than I do around issues of racism, or definitely not. I can talk about patriarchy all day and people will be totally fine with it. Racism, a little less fine, but they don't listen to it. Economic justice, this is where I'm making sure I'm being very careful on how I phrase things because it touches on a core value of Americans, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
money. Like
Yep.
money matters, wealth matters, and it's not to say that again, I want to be clear. I don't have a personal issue with people making money and even working hard and making good money. But I do have an issue of is people that don't give. Like there's this Wesleyan quote, John Wesley in his sermons around economic justice. He had three things. It was like make all you can, save all you can, give all you can. And he talks about how these three things seem contradictory, but really ultimately it's the giving that makes the other two make sense. That it is in actually earning to. He was a staunch advocate of like not just like tithing as a base, but like just giving away your money. He's like, once you have enough to meet your needs and support your family, you need to be supporting others. And again, Wesley has some problems in his theology, but also some really good things. I think that when we're talking about giving within the Wesleyan framework, he's talking about giving it to the poor, and specifically for Wesley, he's talking about giving it for education, which is why we have so many Methodist schools. But what happens in these instances, they're promoting a giving to their leaders, right? So they're promoting like a giving within these Christian fascist spaces, giving to the church that ultimately goes to the leaders' pocketbooks, so that you don't question the wealth, right? So you're like, oh, if I give, I'm going to be rewarded like my leader, and I can have the private jet, I can have the big house, I can have all this stuff. I can accept a gift from the Qatari government that is a new
Goodness.
plane, and no one, and then try to justify it and say, well, it's not a bribe, even though they're giving you a. How can you even make sure that plane isn't like bugged? Like, how can you make sure it is insane?
Insane. It's
It is
insane.
insane.
Well, it's like a spiritual slot machine that will never turn up. It is like the watching people believe that if they just like press the button enough times that they will become like the wealthy and the powerful that they see before them, and like Wesley said, the pious people. And so there's this idea that if we are just pious enough, if we're just giving enough, we will earn that. And you actually never will. It's completely rigged. It's not a real thing that you can achieve for almost everyone. But I also want to say on the wealth and the militarism, I think these are two values that are so ingrained from birth into
Mm-hmm.
Americans that I think it is important in spaces like these to like offer alternatives and to gently engage and say like what would it mean to think about this differently, because Wesley, the anecdote you shared about the atomic bomb, that is something that resonates with me so much, of like being in a community with someone and thinking that we're all talking from the same values, and then suddenly someone says something and it is like, whoa, that very deep rooted seed of inescapable militarism, wealth hoarding, whatever it is like still very embedded in you. So the question I would like to ask both of you is, what is even one thing that you see as an alternative to the Christo-fascist way of thinking about our society and our community, and is there a way that you see to embody something different in addition to naming the thing that we see, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, thank you. Because I was actually going to turn us, because we are nearing the time where we need to shift towards talking about the good, and not just talking about the crazy. For me, it is in what Martin Luther King, you know, broadly speaking, popularized the term beloved community. And for me, beloved community is the framework through which we need to try to resist Christo-fascism. And what the beloved community is, it isn't this kind of utopia where like everything is great and no one has any conflict. It's a commitment to humanizing each other. It's a commitment to seeing people as a full human being and recognizing that in their humanity, like for my humanity to matter, their humanity has to also matter. And right, so to dehumanize them is to dehumanize myself. It is literally the legal moral framework of love God and love neighbor as you love yourself. The greatest commandment. And the reason I think the notion of the beloved community can work is if you are committed to being in solidarity with each other, of to start with understanding and compassion. I think that allows us to recognize, right, and to recognize the humanity in each other, but also to um, understand the suffering that so many people experience. Because quite honestly, the wealthy people, billionaires, are always going to be more on the fascist side. Quite honestly, probably some millionaires because they are so isolated from the real world, an actual real world suffering, um, that their beliefs are framed through a narrow lens that isn't really close to reality. I think most of us actually know what it feels like to want to, have a family, to want to help your kid go to college, to want to be able to take a couple of vacations a year. Like they want to just have some basic normal goods, to not be stressed out about insurance, right? I mean, we've been running ragged this year over insurance issues with trying to get different treatments and services for myself and my son and my wife. And it's annoying. We have good insurance, right? Quote unquote, good insurance. And so for me, the theological framework is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Like that's what I always start with, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount about who is blessed and who is not. Jesus then moves into talking about the ways in which we need to recognize gray areas in rules. You have heard it was said before, like he talks about eye for an eye, but I say to you, turn the other cheek. There's a way in which we have to engage each other from the perspective of understanding, trying to understand where this other person has come from. I feel like if I approach, well, I don't even feel like I know because I've had conversations with poor white farmers in the deep South where they felt a kinship and solidarity with a black dude that lives in Los Angeles. Because I'm like, help me understand what you're going through so I can write about it. Because I see your suffering and this is some BS, and that opens them up to see me in a different way. Rather than just looking at these people and framing them and essentializing people, we have to try to understand each other. And so that's my framing for resistance. It is the beloved community. It is compassion. It starts with understanding. It starts with humanizing folks. And I think that to me, this is Jesus's embodiment of the kind of community he was trying to create and began to create in early Christianity.
Yeah, I don't know how I'm supposed to follow that.
Sorry, I should let you go first because obviously, this is a part of what I do. But anyway, Wesley, I
No,
apologize.
no, I'm kidding. When I think about sort of like, I think there's this conversation about like sort of creating different structures and communities outside of some of these dominant cultural understandings around capitalism, around wealth accumulation. And I definitely like vibe with that because I think so much of what our modern day pushes us to think about is um it asks us to think about so many things that are outside of our ability, like the amount of information we have at our fingertips uh, continues to sort of like push us towards a less connected, less small community sort of perspective. And so much about some of the things that I find valuable and that keep me grounded and keep me centered is the community that I've been able to create that is intentional, that is smaller. Like the reason I found the Loft and chose the Loft was because when I started attending, it was 30 people. And that felt like community. I'd been at churches that were 2,000, 3,000, huge. And I think We think about our presence online and how many followers we have. We think about sort of the reach of our tweets back when it was Twitter. We think about sort of expanding sort of our communities beyond what is maybe even humanly possible. And I find power in thinking locally about the small things that I have some ability to influence for the better. So, yes, the national politics is happening, but my individual advocacy is in local politics. Yes, there's like sort of larger movements against capitalism, but I'm over here unionizing my small university. So it's about sort of helping people articulate and find small ways that they can be more intentional and connected, because I think those connections are what you're going to rely on when society falls, um, or when your sense of society falls, whether it's real or not. Like that, the things that you can reach to are people that are much more connected and accessible to you, and not some rando across the country, across the world that you have a Twitter connection with. There's this sense of like wanting to make sure that you are safe, like actually safe, um, that I think drives a lot of sort of the connections that I try to make with people, because we live in such a chaotic world that wanting to be safe is so important. And um, I think there's a quote that I come back to on a regular basis by Anthony Oliveira. It's from a book or a series of poems that he wrote, and it has to do with sort of coming out. Um, and he writes, when straight people imagine coming out, they imagine a tearful, dramatic revelation all at once. But Alex's story is much like mine, Anthony the author. By degree, when it's safe, when it's too late for them to ruin your life. Coming out is brave not because it's vaguely scary like a school play. It's brave because it's dangerous. Some people get violent, some people punish you financially, some just love you a little less forever. You let them see the little fraction of yourself that you can trust with them, because you've learned love is almost always conditional. Surviving is brave too. And so when I think about community, it is about survival. When I think about what I do to push back against these larger structures, it's about finding ways to survive amidst all of this nonsense and grossness.
That is beautiful, Wesley, and I literally almost started crying. Like, when you read that
I mean,
poem,
me
I was
too.
like,
I mean, that's why I keep
yeah,
it around,
yeah.
because
I'm
it's
like, that
so.
is. I'm like, oh my gosh, that is so good. We need to make sure we remember to put that in the show notes too, or at least a reference to it, so people can find it. Everest, what about you? Like, what kind of ways are you trying to, or how do you imagine what this resistance to kind of Christo fascism take shape for you? What does it look like?
Well, I think you both touched on my one of my core beliefs, which is like always starting small and, imagining where we want to go, but then figuring out what the tiny steps are that we can take right now. And I think, Wesley, you made me think about a good way to respond to this thing that I always come. I think when we have these conversations and we get too abstract about it, those core ideas of militarism and capitalism and all of the things that have been planted in us start coming out, and people are like, well, but we are never going to live in a society that is not a capitalist society, or we're never going to be a part of a nation that is not militarized. But I think there is a way to say, okay, but what about like right here? What about in this group of 30 people? What does it look like to have a community with each other that looks like something different? And I think hopefully you have me back for an episode on coalition building, because that is really where my head and heart have been lately, and about having bridging gaps, I think, and like you said, Dr. Carter, approaching people with curiosity and compassion and prioritizing their humanity over anything else, and trying to find a way to reach that, um, beyond whatever other stuff is going on, feels really valuable to me. I think something that comes up in our queer group a lot is uh, this idea that people are not the the ideas that they have, which I think is a really hard thing to stomach sometimes. But there are so many people that we love that have ideas that are so harmful to us. And I have heard people be like, I refuse to stop loving this person, even though they have ideas that really hurt me. And I insist on believing that there is a human there that exists beyond whatever ideology is poisoning them. And I think insisting on that reaching and insisting on that um, longing for connection, even when it is really difficult, is how I try to embody it. But it is just really complicated and
It's
hard and
hard.
messy.
I think this is where actually, Everest, you said something that really allows me to talk a little bit about. Um, one thing is like I'm like we all should be talking to therapists. That's
Mm-hmm.
another thing we need to be doing because what you just articulated is recognizing that it's called it's you're critiquing what's called a unity of mind perspective, which internal family systems therapy basically recognizing we all have different parts. And like just because someone does something racist or says something racist or sexist or queerphobic doesn't mean that they are queerphobic, racist, or sexist. Like that's the totality of who they are. That means they did this thing, right? And we have to recognize that we all have spaces to grow. I know I have said things that have been patriarchal. I know I've said things that have been sexist. I know I've said things that are queerphobic. I know I've said things that have been racist. But that doesn't mean that's who I am. That means there's a part of me that still has to heal from that kind of and unlearn those systems that I've seen and become normalized for me. And that's difficult for many of us to grasp because it requires us to understand the complexity within ourselves, right? To not shame ourselves for the thoughts that we have and the feelings that we know aren't in alignment with our values, but to turn towards those own parts of ourselves with compassion and care and understanding and try to heal whatever needs to be healed so I can unlearn that ideology that has led me to believe something I know I don't want to actually believe. And perhaps when you talk about starting small, it starts with yourself. Like it really does start with how we view ourselves and how we um, come to God or come to our relationship with God as an individual and how that might shape how we interact with others. I always say compassion towards others starts with self-compassion. Fundamentally, I think that's where it is. And I want to say two things, and I want to move to the to end this segment and move to the question from the listener. But it's not surprising that the two queer folks that are on the podcast are in coalition building. Like there's something there, right? Because both of you do this. So there's something there in terms of that probably needs to be unpacked. So definitely, I mean, Everest, we've already figured out probably two more episodes where we know we're gonna the three of us,
Absolutely.
the political trinity will come back together. But the last thing I want to say is I know some of you are probably hearing or maybe hearing what we're saying and be somewhat skeptical about what this actually looks like on the ground in terms of the beloved community or the kind of communities we're talking about. And I was reminded of an article that I actually wrote called Race Animals in the Beloved Community. And where I talk a little bit more about how this even can help us resist, broad structures of evil. So I just want to read kind of the end of that article. So I wrote, in the beloved community, racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an inclusive spirit where the plurality of human experience will be recognized as fully human. Anti-ecological and extractivist thinking will be replaced with an understanding of the interdependence and interconnectedness of all life. In the beloved community, love and trust triumph over fear and hatred. Peace with justice prevails over war and military conflict because we have delinked our minds from oppressive hierarchical values that have placed a certain kind of human as the pinnacle of evolution, and in its place, we have developed an understanding of the human person that is rooted in love, solidarity, and an interdependent flourishing. To be sure, the beloved community is not devoid of interpersonal, group, or international conflict. As justice oriented activists, we recognize that conflict is an inevitable part of the human experience. However, We also believe that conflicts can be resolved peacefully and adversaries can be reconciled through a mutual, determined commitment to nonviolence and restorative acts of compassion. All conflicts in beloved community should end with reconciliation of adversaries and cooperating together in a spirit of radical compassion. Imagine a world where animal rights and racial justice activists can live into this vision and invite others to do the same. Now imagine yourself helping to build this world using the skills and talents that are unique to you. And finally, go and do your best to help breathe life into this imaginative existence. Amen. So that is the
Amen.
that's what I wrote to in that chapter. We actually had another listener email that's and I actually need to email that listener back around because I don't think they knew or they hadn't been listening long enough to know that I write about animals and animal rights and animal stuff, and they're probably going to be like, "Oh my gosh!" So I'm gonna let them know that. So listener questions. Thank you. We have our first question that we want to spend some time answering, and well, I guess I should say our second actually, technically. But I want to get to it because I do feel like it's a question that does come up in different spaces. And it is from Mika. And Mika, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Mika was like, it's still shocking to me. I know Wesley, you've said this multiple times that we have people listening to us from all over the world and
Yeah,
people sending us messages. And I'm like, oh my
absolutely.
gosh, like and honestly, thank you so much for sending it because it reminds us that we're not speaking into the void. There are people who actually genuinely need what we're doing, and that our church community is able to use, quite honestly, the money that we do have to do ministry, and that this actually is ministry that's reaching people who otherwise struggle to even call themselves a Christian because of their progressive values, as Mika described in their email, which I totally just absolutely love. But the question Mika asked that she wanted us to get into is, what do progressive Christians think, or just our own individual thoughts about Satan, Lucifer, the fall, and all of that? Ultimately, does Satan exist, or is he more of a metaphor? Everest, I want to turn it over to you because I know when we were doing the planning, you had a very interesting take on this that I thought is worth us spending some time to unpack.
Well, I have caught some shade for this in many Christian circles, but I am a universalist. I do not believe in hell, for starters, and I have many scripture-based arguments to back that up.
Yep.
Have me back sometime. But
Fourth episode, love it.
I will say, in just in a purely anecdotal sense, it has been well over 10 years since my personal faith and spirituality was centered on the afterlife. And I think that allowing ourselves to move away from fixating on that makes space for us to embody our faith and embody Christ in ways that are much more, in my opinion, aligned with how we are called to be. But I think specifically in queer group, I have seen how harmful theology centered around hell and damnation can be to people. And I have heard no less than five, many more actually, accounts of people being young children and like not being able to sleep, or going up to strangers at the mall in tears and like begging people to accept Jesus into their hearts so that they would not suffer and die forever. And I think that especially affects queer people because oftentimes we are also included in the group that will end up in eternal fire. But I think that for me, learning to let go of that and helping people to, if not entirely let it go, but again, kind of imagine what their faith would look like without that fear and that foundation of shame and terror, like true terror, allows again for a practice of Christianity that is so much more loving and open and forgiving and redemptive and true, I would say.
Wesley, what say you? What was some of the
Yeah.
stuff that came up for you?
I mean, similarly, I think it's been. I don't remember the last time I thought about Satan in any sense other than sort of like casual throw off statements like someone will this is a made up story, but like someone will say something like, I don't know that I want to watch Wicked, and the response being, get behind me, Satan. It's like it's in that way. Or I think my favorite is like, not today, Satan, when something annoying comes my way. But sometimes when something comes my way, I'm like, yes, today, Satan. So it works both ways. It's just something that I have a very sort of like distant, loose connection, because I much like you, I think the idea that I would believe in a God that sentences people to eternal punishment like rings quite the opposite of what Jesus was saying. And the limits that it places on human flourishing, because it becomes this like rule based, I don't want to end up in hell sort of society, uh makes it like not something that I want to be engaged in. And so for me, like I don't think Satan exists other than like a bedtime story. That said, like so much of that world is embedded because some of the scariest movies are possession movies to me. So like it's still like it's there because you don't go 18 years of this being hammered in your head and sort of jettison it immediately. But no, I don't think about Satan. I don't think about Lucifer or hell. I don't find it helpful towards advocating for people to have better, flourishing lives. Um, yeah, that's sort of my engagement with it.
No, I think both of you, I mean, we're all going to say similar things. I'll just get to the theological aspects of it, just in case this is also what Mika wants, in the sense that during the time of Christ, they believed in what's called a three-tiered universe. Like you have the firmament, which is like where we are, like the ground, literally. And then you have like above us, like which is like the heavens, where the gods are, and then below us, where the evil gods are, right? So literally, think about like the gods of the underworld within the kind of Greek, Roman mythological, gods way you might think about it, right? That was the science of the time. That was the science of the day. So they're talking about hell in the Bible. They're talking, and I use the term Sheol often. They're talking about the underworld. It's this idea of where Jesus or God or whatever descends into the underworld to liberate those held captive by the gods of the underworld. But this was within that framework of a three-tiered universe that was in conversation with the dominant religions of the day, which would have been, Greek and Roman religion. The Bible, at the same time, in this sense, you can find robust arguments, as Everest said, um, to understand that Satan is not a fallen angel, but rather the manifestation of a way we externalize human selfishness, right? So when Job is wrestling with Satan, or when Job is having this conversation, when God says, "I'm going to allow all these bad things to happen," this is a book that helps people understand how you respond when terrible things happen to you. Do you turn to selfishness and blame God, or do you actually still turn towards God? When Jesus is in the desert wrestling and trying to make a decision about what he's going to do in those 4 days of temptation, it's, do you turn to selfishness or do you lean on the tradition? Like all these times Satan is in the Bible, it's counter, contrasted, I should say, with a choice of tradition, of God, of following the laws and prescriptions that have been commanded, or you're going to turn to human selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's very helpful to understand that. So even within the Bible, the idea of Satan is much more an idea. Now, with respect to hell, yeah, personally, I don't believe that there is a hell. I believe that there is a heaven, and I believe that if you live in ways that contradict what, again, Jesus talks about Matthew 25, do you take care of the least of these? Do you visit the poor? Like all the things that are listed in Matthew 25 and the separation of the sheep and goats. My personal belief, for the sake of justice, is that if you are the selfish person who doesn't do those things, then this is your heaven. And when you die, it is just the end. ta-da, like that's basically what I would say. Some people have different beliefs. There are progressive Christians who believe that everyone goes through some form of redemption process. You have someone like Marjorie Suhaki, who's a process theologian, who thinks about these kinds of things. I think for me, from my perspective, for justice, people need to be held accountable. Accountability matters to me so much. And it is a joy to get a chance to live life, and it's your opportunity to take it seriously and live it in the ways that actually bring meaning and bring purpose and value and community to others. Or you can not do that. I think that's people's choice, and so I feel like we need to be held accountable for the choices that we make. And so I think the last thing I'll say is that, to your point, Everest, about making your faith not about the afterlife. Jesus, like we need the earliest gospel that we have in Mark, when Jesus, his first message, when he comes into the city after he spends time in the desert, he says, Jesus came to Galilee announcing God's good news, saying, now is the time. Here comes God's kingdom. Change your hearts and lives and trust his good news. Now is the time. Not later is the time. Not after you die is the time. Now is the time. Like Jesus's message was about the kingdom of God is at hand. There is aspects of the message that are about to come afterwards, and that it is something that we are moving towards. But it's about how do we create what I call the beloved community right now in tangible actions. This is why Jesus was talking and critiquing the wealthy, why he was spending time with the poor, why Jesus was spending time with prostitutes, why he's humanizing the lepers, why he's doing all this work, because he's creating heaven on earth, even in his prayer, right? He's like, make it on earth as it is in heaven. And so our faith ought be grounded in the realities of today rather than future oriented, because the future oriented faith is actually, I would argue, subject to manipulation such that it leads to kind of a fascist state. So, Mika, thank you so much for that question. Hopefully that was a sufficient answer for you. Did you want to say something, Everest?
I want to say one more thing. Now you really have to have me back, because I love a conversation about this, and I feel curious about what you just said, and I want to share what I have to say too. So,
oh man,
anyway,
teaser.
So stay tuned, everyone.
Watch this space.
Mika, I want to say that, well, this is just a way longer conversation, and I really understand that if you are someone that has been raised like really in a community that hell is a central tenet of your faith, it is actually super unhelpful for someone to just be like, well, I don't believe in hell. So, and so I just want to say that, like, it is a ongoing conversation. And you can reach out to any of us if you want to talk about it more. Because, well, I've had so many of these conversations, and I think it is just like something that we have to approach with a lot of love and patience, and with the knowledge that like none of us can ever be certain about any of it. And so,
Exactly.
So right.
I just want to say that this is like what we believe and what we have come to in our readings and our studies and our spiritual journeys, but that wherever you are on that journey, we are really happy to engage with you and hear where you are.
No, thank you so much for that, Everest, because I mean, quite honestly, it's the why. Like, I would argue, if you believe in a God of love, like, do you believe God is a God of love as your fundamental starting point? And if you believe in a God that is love, as it says in the text in so many places, would it make sense? Does it follow for that God of love to create hell, right? And I would argue that it isn't, right? But there is a space for accountability. And so, yes, so we have at least we have 3 more episodes where we know Everest is going to be on in the next few weeks, where we're talking about politics and apparently talking about hell too. So it's going to be a ball of fun. It's going to be a ball of fun. So, well, I want to thank you all for joining us for the Progressive Christians podcast. The Progressive Christians podcast is a ministry of the Loft, worship community of Westwood United Methodist Church. If you would like to connect with us and be a part of the conversation, you can find us on Instagram or YouTube or TikTok at The Progressive Christians. If you like the show, please rate, review, share, and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you're using. Please give us a 5-star review. Don't be a hater. We definitely shout out to our wonderful audio engineer, AJ Goodlow, for doing the good work of making us sound amazing. Thank you, Wesley. Thank you, Everest. And thank you all for listening, and we'll see y'all later. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.